Okay, so for me at least, and maybe hopefully for you guys, this is one of the most exciting lectures that we'll be giving for the semester. It's certainly right here in our own home and neighborhood. You hopefully will be familiar with at least some of these buildings, and you can easily go and look at most of these, although a few of them are gone, but most of them are still here, including the great Carson Peary Scott building, technically Schlesinger and Mayer design by Louis Sullivan that we'll be talking about here. And this is really beginning to talk about the skyscraper and this great architectural revolution of building buildings that go vertical. We saw taller buildings, in the past, the Great Pyramids or something like that, but those were not buildings, right? It was just a giant tomb. It was solid masonry. But starting in the late 19th century, we start to see people building vertically, and it's a fundamental shift and revolution in architecture as well as culture, right? It changes cities fundamentally, but it certainly is a major shift in architecture. Little pop quiz. Anybody know the importance of October 8th, 1871?
I feel like this one's for me. Is it the Chicago Fire?
Yeah, it was the
Yes,
Chicago
the
Fire.
fire. Yes, the firefighter gets the first crack at it. Yes, this is the Great Chicago Fire. Happens or starts on October 8th, 1871. So here's a rendering view of that. Probably pretty dramatic, but this is based on the descriptions. This is pretty much what was happening. The city was just completely engulfed in flames. High winds, very dry. It had been basically very dry for weeks. And so it was a tinderbox, and a fire started, and the strong winds coming from the southwest just blew that fire all across the city, and people were fleeing across. There weren't a lot of bridges across the river at that time, and so it was kind of a chaos of people trying to get across the river and flee to the north side, and many fled to the lakefront trying to seek shelter in Lake Michigan. Um, here's the view of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. She was blamed for starting the fire. That she somehow apparently would go milking her cow in the middle of the night, and the cow kicked over the lantern and it started a fire in the barn and that spread. Completely false. It was completely made up by yellow journalists back in the time who were very anti-Irish. O'Leary, of course, was an Irish woman. There was a strong anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment in the mid to late 19th century, even in the early 20th century. And so she was an easy scapegoat for this. We don't really know what started it. There were a lot of fires that were occurring around this time because things were so dry, and several pretty big ones, but obviously this one got just completely out of control. Partly got out of control because the fire department was exhausted. They had been fighting all these series of fires for weeks, and had largely contained them. But when this one started, the firefighters were completely exhausted. They were initially sent to the wrong location. So by the time they finally got to where the fire was, it had already expanded dramatically and just got out of control where they couldn't stop it. So on the left there is a view of, it starts down in Bridgeport neighborhood where the fire academy is now, is the site of, where Mrs. O'Leary's barn was. It probably did start right around that location and possibly in her barn, but it wasn't from her. She was in bed. She was asleep in the middle of the night. You milk cows in the morning, you don't milk them at 10 o'clock at night. But anyway, it spread quickly. It jumped the south branch of the river. It burned out most of what we'd call the near south side now, or river south. Burned up the loop in this area here, jumped the river, and really burned up most of River North neighborhood, all the way up even into the area beyond North Avenue, beyond, into the area that is Old Town and so forth, and then began to peter out. They finally got some rain. They did some what's called fire breaks, where you just demolish whole blocks of buildings so that the fire can't continuously spread, and then it can't jump across, a wide swath. And eventually, they were able to get it under control. There were around 300 people were killed, relatively low number because the fire, even though it spread, people were able to get away from it quickly enough, despite that last image that showed sort of a panic fleeing across the river. But over 17,000 buildings were destroyed, including the entire commercial district of the Loop. Over 200 million in damage, which would be well over $3 billion in today's funds, and wiped out the city, essentially, the biggest part of the city. So here's a postcard, his photo view, and the days after the fire, completely burned out. I mean, nothing was left in these areas. In the Loop, especially, nothing was left. It wasn't like it got a few buildings and there were some that survived. There was nothing but burned out shells at best. You can see the streetcars, horse-pulled streetcars are running again. They cleared rubble out of the streets, but that was it for months. Here's a view of what the city and the commercial district, the Loop, looked like prior to the fire. We're talking about essentially low-rise buildings. You typically 5, maybe 6 stories was about as tall a building as you would want to build. Wasn't necessarily because technically you couldn't build taller, it's that there's no such thing as an elevator before this time. And if you don't have an elevator, you got to climb up the stairs, right? And people don't want to walk up more than about 4 flights of stairs. And so usually the cheap rents, whether they were apartments or whether they were commercial spaces or offices, were on the top floors, ironically, in the up until the late 1800s, because you had to walk up all those stairs. You imagine carrying groceries, carrying if you had a baby and you're trying to carry all that up, or certainly, you got an office in one of these upper floors, and you're like, yeah, I'm up on the 5th floor. You'll have to walk up to meet with me. Like, I'll take the office on the 3rd floor, thanks. I'll meet with that lawyer or something. So this is what the Loop looked like. They were, essentially sort of neo-Renaissance style buildings with arched windows and cornices and pediments. They look like Italian palazzos and so forth. I do want to point out, this is along State Street. I want to point out, anybody notice the sign right here? You see what that says? See, it says Gilbert and Sampson. George Gilbert, that great-great-great-grandfather who was one of the founders of Riverside, he was a successful auctioneer and then had a furniture business. And this was, they had their furniture store on the 2nd and 3rd floor of this building here. All burned down in the fire. So here's another view of the city and the ruins that were left after the fire. So there's kind of a myth, right, about the Chicago fire and architecture. And the idea was, okay, the city burned, I mean, completely wiped out, and all these architects rebuilt the city with this Chicago school architecture, these high rises and this modern form of architecture. That is actually completely false. And if you're if you're given the true or false question on the quiz, that'll cover this later, that would be false. What it does do is, because this city is wiped out, it actually coincided with a panic in the early 1870s, which was a deep recession. It was an opportunity for architects to get work. And so people, mostly East Coast, where you had a lot more cities and development, a lot of architects who were young and ambitious, living the East Coast in Boston or New York or Philadelphia maybe, they came to Chicago because there was work here. There was work during the recession, and you were set for years because so many people had to build buildings, and so there was a very, very high demand for architects. And initially, the city was rebuilt much the same way it had been built before, just in masonry, fireproof masonry, not in wood or cast iron, which they figured out would melt in there. They would not allow just raw cast iron any longer. You had to encase it in masonry fireproofing that would keep it from getting too hot and melting and collapsing. And so initially, the city was essentially rebuilt the same way that it had looked prior to that. You know, 5, 6 story buildings, masonry, stone, arched windows, Italianate styles and Gothic styles and so forth. But all of these architects were here, they were getting really successful, and they started thinking about what happens in the next round, and all the things that come together and create the modern high rise. All of these young, ambitious architects are here because of the fire, and that allows the Chicago School to emerge out of the fire indirectly, not directly initially afterwards. All right, so I think that's a good place to stop for the day.